The key didn't fit. Ruth Calloway stood on the front porch of the house she had lived in for 43 years, her hand resting on the wooden railing her husband had built the summer before he died. The railing had cracked in places over the decades. She had never replaced it. Some things you keep not because they are perfect, but because they are true. The morning was cold. October in Shelby Falls, Ohio, carried a particular kind of chill. Not the sharp, angry cold of January, but something quieter. Something that settled into your bones like a reminder. The maple tree in the front yard had gone red overnight, the way it always did this time of year. The way she had watched it turn red 43 times from this exact spot. She tried the key again, slower this time, more deliberate. The way you try something a second time when you already know the answer, but need to be certain. The lock didn't respond. The brass of it gleamed in the pale morning light, too bright, too clean, too new. It didn't belong on this door. This door had known a different lock for 4 decades. She would have recognized the old one with her eyes closed. Behind her, Vivian shifted her weight carefully. One hand pressed lightly against the porch post for balance. At 84, Vivian moved the way she did everything deliberately without complaint, aware of every inch of ground beneath her feet. "Try it again," Vivian said. Ruth didn't answer. She was still looking at the lock, not at the key. At the lock. Something was wrong. Not in the way that a stiff door is wrong or a key cut slightly off is wrong. Something was wrong in the way that a room looks wrong when furniture has been moved, and you can't immediately name what changed, only that everything is different now. She reached out and touched the brass plate surrounding the keyhole. Cool, smooth. No scratches, no worn edges, no decades of daily contact. Someone had installed this within the last few days, maybe less. "Ruth, I heard you." She tried the key one final time, pressing it slowly into the lock, turning it with the practiced ease of 43 years of muscle memory. The key stopped. The lock held firm. The door did not open. Ruth lowered her hand. She stood very still for a moment, the key hanging at her side, the October air moving softly through the red maple leaves above them. A car passed on the street behind her. A dog barked somewhere 2 houses down. The world continued unaware. Then she turned and looked through the window beside the door. The living room was empty, not just cleared of people, empty. The couch that had sat against the far wall for 30 years gone. The oak side table her husband had found at an estate sale in 1987. The one with the slightly uneven leg she had never had fixed, because fixing it would have meant admitting she noticed gone. The photographs that had covered the wall above the fireplace, every one of them gone. The braided rug her mother had made before her hands gave out gone. The curtains. The lamp with the amber shade that cast warm light across the room every evening from September through April. Gone. All of it. Ruth stared through the glass for a long moment. Then she straightened up, squared her shoulders the way she had learned to do in 30 years of nursing, when a situation required composure, before it required anything else, and she turned to face the street. She already knew who was coming. She heard the car before she saw it. A dark sedan moving slowly down the block. The way a car moves when the driver already knows where he's going and is in no hurry to arrive. It pulled against the curb and sat there for a moment, engine idling. Then the engine stopped. Gideon Calloway stepped out. He was 58 years old, her son. He had his father's height and his father's build, but he moved differently than his father had. His father had moved through the world with a kind of easy certainty, the way a man moves when he is comfortable in his own skin. Gideon moved the way a man moves when he is carrying something heavy and would prefer no one notice. He wore a dark jacket. His hands were in his pockets. He did not look at the house. He did not look at the railing his grandfather had built. He did not look at the maple tree or the porch or the window or any of the 43 years visible in every board and brick and worn surface of that place. He looked at the ground. Then he looked at Ruth. "You shouldn't have come back here," he said. The words landed without drama, without anger, without heat of any kind. That was perhaps the worst thing about them. They had clearly been rehearsed. He had stood somewhere alone or not alone and practiced saying those words until they came out flat and final, stripped of everything that might complicate them. Vivian stepped forward from behind Ruth, and her voice when it came was sharp in the way it only got when she was genuinely frightened. "Gideon, what is this? What are you doing?" Gideon reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded envelope. He held it at his side, not extending it yet, not putting it away, just holding it. "The property has been legally transferred," he said. Ruth said nothing. "There are documents," he continued. "Everything was done properly. You'll want to look at them when you're ready." Vivian's voice cracked at the edges. "Transferred to who?" Gideon paused. 1 second. Not long, but long enough. "To me." The maple tree dropped a leaf. It fell slowly in the still air, red and curled at the edges, and landed without sound on the porch between them. Ruth looked at the envelope in her son's hand. She looked at the lock on her door. She looked at the empty room through the window. And then she looked at her son, and she saw something in his face she had not seen before. Not guilt exactly, but the specific look of a man who made a decision and then lived with it long enough to stop looking for a way out. "I signed hospital forms," she said. Her voice was steady. "Insurance documents, consent paperwork. Some of the documents were included in that packet. I never signed anything for this house." Gideon finally looked up at her directly. "Mom, I never signed anything for this house, Gideon." He held her gaze for 2 seconds. 3. Then he looked down again. "The paperwork went through. It's done legally. There's nothing." "Open the door," Ruth said. He didn't move. "I'd like to go inside. It's cold. We can sit down. You can show me whatever you've brought." Her voice was the voice of 30 years in hospitals, calm in rooms where calm was the only tool that worked. "Open the door." "I can't do that." Vivian moved closer, and now her voice was something different. Not sharp. Broken. "Gideon, please. We stood out here all night. We came back this morning. We have nowhere. Just let us in so we can talk. You can explain. You can't stay here." He said it the way you say something you have said before, the way you say something you've been telling yourself for weeks in preparation for the moment you have to say it to someone else. Vivian fell quiet. Ruth looked past her son through the window again at the bare walls and the bare floor and the fireplace with nothing above it. "You cleared it out," she said. Not this morning. This took time. She turned back to him. When did you start? Gideon didn't answer. The furniture, the photographs, my mother's rug. Ruth's voice remained level, but something beneath it had changed. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more permanent. When did Loretta start planning this? The name landed differently than anything else she had said. She watched it land on her son's face. She watched something move in his eyes, quick and complicated, gone before she could fully read it. He said nothing. Where are we supposed to go? Vivian asked. Her voice had gone very quiet now, the way it went when she stopped fighting against a thing and began simply absorbing it. Gideon looked past them both at the street. I'm sure you'll be able to figure something out. That was all. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of 43 years or 30 years of nursing money that had put food on this property's table, or decades of a woman raising a child in these rooms and choosing every day to make sure that child had more than she did. None of it. Just a quiet dismissal. The kind that comes from a man who has been talked into something and has made peace with it by agreeing not to think about it too carefully. Ruth looked down at the key in her hand. The old one. The one she had carried for decades. She closed her fingers around it, slowly feeling the worn metal, the familiar weight of it. She put it back in her coat pocket. Come on, she said to Vivian. Vivian didn't move immediately. She was still looking at Gideon, looking at him the way you look at someone you watched grow up, someone you fed and held and sat beside through fevers and failures and ordinary Sundays, looking at him the way you look at that person when you realize you do not recognize what he has become. Vivian. Ruth's voice was soft but certain. There's nothing here for us right now. Those words cost something to say. Ruth felt the cost of them. Slowly, Vivian turned. They walked down the porch steps together, careful and deliberate, one step at a time. As they passed the railing, Vivian's hand brushed across the worn wood without stopping. Her eyes stayed forward. They did not look back. At the end of the driveway, Ruth stopped for just a moment. The house stood behind them, silent and strangely unfamiliar now, as though the new lock had changed not just the door, but something fundamental about the relationship between the building and the two women who had poured their lives into it. Vivian reached for Ruth's hand. Ruth let her take it. They walked. They did not sleep that night. Not really. They sat on a metal bench at the bus stop on Crescent Avenue, 2 towns over, wrapped in the coats they had been wearing when they drove to the house that morning, the coats. They had not thought to bring anything else along with, because they had believed fully and without question that they were simply returning home after a doctor's appointment. The way they had returned home after 10,000 ordinary things across the years. The overhead light above the bench hummed and flickered. The street was empty. Somewhere a truck downshifted on the highway 2 miles north. The temperature dropped steadily through the night, the way October temperatures in Ohio do not dramatically, just persistently, degree by degree, hour by hour. Vivian pulled her coat tighter. I keep thinking he'll call. Ruth looked at her hands in her lap. The same hands that had started IV lines in emergency rooms at 3 in the morning. The same hands that had braided her son's hair when he was small. That had packed his lunches and built this life and signed those hospital forms in March without her glasses on because the nurse had been rushing and Ruth had been coming out of anesthesia. And Loretta had been there, standing at the bedside, holding the clipboard, smiling. "He won't," Ruth said. "You don't know that for certain." Ruth turned to look at her oldest friend. "I do." Vivian looked away. Her jaw tightened. "People don't just do this. Not to their own mothers." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The bench was cold through her coat. The light flickered twice and steadied. "Some do," she said finally. "When someone convinces them the math works out." Vivian turned back sharply. "The math. The math. I'm 87, Vivian. I had a cardiac procedure 6 months ago. Loretta is practical. She did the math." The name hung in the night air between them. Loretta. Not Gideon. Loretta. Vivian looked down at her shoes. After a long silence, she said, "I knew." Ruth didn't respond right away. 2 years ago, Vivian continued, "I saw the loan paperwork on Gideon's kitchen table when I was watching their dog that weekend they went to Columbus. I didn't go looking for it. It was just there. 3 accounts, 2 of them behind. Numbers I wouldn't have expected." She paused. "I should have told you." "You did tell me." Vivian looked up. "You didn't listen." "No," Ruth said. "I didn't." Another silence. Longer this time. The truck sound from the highway faded. A leaf skittered across the sidewalk in a small gust of wind. "You chose to believe him," Vivian said. "Not accusation, just fact. I chose to believe what I'd built." Ruth's voice was even. "I believed the boy I raised wouldn't do this. That's not the same as trusting Gideon the man at 58. I made an error. Ruth, I made an error." She repeated it without self-pity, simply as information. "I won't make it twice." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. The woman she had known since they were both in their 20s, standing in empty rooms with bare floors and insufficient money, and enough stubbornness between them to build something from nothing. The woman who had worked morning shifts at a diner and night shifts at a hospital in the same week, and never spoken about it as though it were remarkable. The woman who had held Vivian's hand through 2 bereavements and 1 diagnosis, and every small and large erosion that 84 years will eventually bring. "What do we do now?" Vivian asked. Ruth looked out at the dark street ahead. The question was not rhetorical. It was real and heavy, and she gave it the silence it deserved. "We don't stay here," she said finally, "and we don't go back." "Then where?" Ruth didn't answer. Not because she didn't have thoughts, but because the thoughts were still forming the way plans form in people who have spent their lives solving problems that weren't supposed to have solutions. She was still working it out. By morning, the cold had settled into both of them completely. Not dangerously, but thoroughly, the way a long cold night at 87 and 84 works its way past coats and stubbornness and into the joints and the breath. They stood at the edge of Crescent Avenue as the town woke up around them. Cars began to appear. A man walked a dog past them without glancing over. A light came on in the diner across the street. The smell of coffee drifting faintly through the October air. Ruth looked down the road in the direction that led away from town. "Let's walk," she said. Vivian looked at her. "Toward what? I don't know yet." They walked slowly, pace set by endurance and by the careful management of 84-year-old knees and an 87-year-old heart. that had been opened and repaired 6 months ago and still carried the memory of it in every steep incline. The road took them past the outer edge of Shelby Falls, past houses that gave way to wider lots, to rusted fences, to stretches of land the town had quietly stopped paying attention to. The air smelled of damp earth and iron, cold leaves, the specific smell of American Midwestern autumn in a place where the land remembers everything. They walked for nearly 40 minutes. Then Ruth stopped. She had seen something, a shape beyond a sagging chain-link fence, half hidden beneath a decade of accumulated overgrowth. Not a house, not a shed. Something longer, lower, built at a particular angle that caught the morning light in a particular way. She moved toward the fence without speaking. Vivian followed, breathing carefully. "What is it?" Ruth reached the fence and pulled aside a tangle of dead vines with both hands. Beneath them, the structure emerged more clearly. Long glass panels, most of them broken. Metal frames rusted through in places but still standing. The skeleton of something that had been designed with precision and then abandoned without ceremony. "A greenhouse," Ruth said quietly. Vivian stepped beside her and looked. "You're certain?" "I've seen enough of them." Ruth's eyes moved along the structure, reading it the way she had learned to read things, not for what they appeared to be at first glance, but for what they were underneath. Someone built this carefully. Look at the angle of the framing. Look at the way it faces. Vivian looked. South-facing. South-facing. Maximum light retention. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. The door was gone. The frame where it had hung remained a rectangle of rusted metal, leading into a space that smelled of cold soil and old metal. And beneath that, something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something faintly, impossibly green. "We can't stay in there," Vivian said. Ruth wasn't listening. She was already testing the fence. "Ruth." Vivian's voice carried the weight of 84 years of watching this woman make decisions that looked unreasonable from the outside and turned out to be something else entirely. "There is no roof. It is October. We are not young. I'm aware of how old we are. Then be aware that this is a broken building in an empty field and not a solution to anything." Ruth turned to her. Her eyes were steady and clear, and carrying something that Vivian had seen in them before, not in recent years, but long ago, in the early years. The look Ruth got when she saw a problem other people had written off as permanent. "No one has been here in years," Ruth said, "which suggests there's a reason. Or everyone just stopped looking." Ruth turned back to the fence. Two different things. She pulled the fence back, the metal scraping and resisting a loud protest from something that had held its position for a long time. The gap wasn't wide, but it was enough. Ruth went through first. Vivian stood on the other side for a moment. She looked at the broken structure, the overgrown ground, the cold morning light falling through shattered glass panels. She looked at her friend, who was already walking toward the entrance without waiting to be followed the way Ruth had always moved forward, because stopping was never the plan. Vivian went through the fence. The first thing Ruth felt when she stepped inside was warmth. Not enough warmth to be comfortable, not enough warmth to explain logically, but distinctly measurably warmer than the air outside. The broken glass panels filtered the morning light in uneven strips, And somewhere in the architecture of the thing, the angle, the framing, the south-facing orientation, heat was being trapped and held in a way that the October air outside had not managed to touch completely. Vivian noticed it immediately. That shouldn't be possible. No, Ruth said. It shouldn't. She walked further in her shoes, pressing into the ground. The second thing she noticed was the soil. Not hard-packed, not dry, not the dead earth she would have expected from a building abandoned for 15 or more years. The ground beneath her feet gave slightly. Damp. Not wet, but alive with moisture in a way that made no sense given everything else about the place. Ruth crouched carefully, ignoring the protest from her knees, and pressed her fingers into the soil. She pulled them back and looked at the dark earth clinging to her skin. "Feel this," she said. Vivian crouched beside her with effort and pressed her own hand into the ground. Her eyes widened. "It's wet." Not just wet. Ruth turned her hand over, studying the darkness of the soil. This has been consistently watered. Regularly. By who? Not by who. Ruth stood slowly scanning the greenhouse with new attention. By what? She walked deeper into the space, stepping over a collapsed section of metal framing, moving toward the far end where the glass had almost entirely surrendered to time and weather. And then she stopped. Near the base of the far wall where the soil deepened and darkened further, something small pushed up through the ground. Green. Unmistakably green. Alive. Vivian came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "That's impossible," Vivian said finally. Ruth moved closer slowly until she was close enough to see the leaves clearly. Small and fragile and carrying the specific, unmistakable green of something that was not merely surviving but growing. She did not touch it. She held her hand an inch above it, the way you hold your hand above something you don't want to disturb. "It's been here a while," she said. "Look at the stem. This didn't appear overnight. Ruth, there's no water source visible. There's barely a roof. It's October in Ohio. There's a water source." Ruth straightened and turned her attention to the ground around the plant. She brushed aside a thin layer of loose topsoil. Beneath it, the ground darkened further, almost black with moisture, concentrated at one point, and from somewhere deeper came a sound. Soft. Barely there. A trickle. Rhythmic. Constant. Vivian heard it. "Is that—" "Water moving," Ruth said. "Underground." She found a piece of broken metal frame on the ground nearby and used it to scrape carefully at the surface soil until it struck something solid. A hollow, dull sound. She cleared the dirt with her hands, cold seeping into her fingers, ignoring it until a surface emerged. Curved. Smooth. Not stone. Not wood. A pipe. Old but intact, running horizontally beneath the floor of the greenhouse. Vivian leaned in close. "Plumbing, still flowing," Ruth said. She sat back on her heels. Her breath was unsteady, not from effort, but from the particular feeling that comes when something broken turns out to be less broken than anyone knew. This wasn't just a greenhouse, Vivian. This was a system. The angle of the structure collects rainwater. The pipe distributes it through the floor. The soil stays alive even without full cover. Someone designed this to keep working after they stop working it. Vivian was very quiet. Ruth stood and moved to the far corner of the structure, where a section of floor was slightly raised compared to the rest, and where the soil had a particular quality, darker, more compact, more structured than the ground around it. She pressed her fingers into it and then moved them sideways until they found the edge of something. Not a pipe this time. Something flatter, harder. She cleared the soil from it with both hands until she could see what it was. A box. Metal sealed with a simple latch green with oxidation but structurally intact. Vivian came to stand above her. What is that? Ruth worked the latch. It resisted, then gave. She lifted the lid. Inside, protected by the metal and the sealed air, a folded piece of paper, a small packet of seeds, and a leather-bound journal. Its cover warped from years of soil moisture, but its pages still intact. Ruth lifted the journal carefully and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, unhurried. The handwriting of someone who wrote with purpose. This garden belongs to the people of Shelby Falls. I built it for them. If you are reading this, I am gone, and the garden is still here. That is as it should be. Eleanor Marsh, 1989. Ruth read it once. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at Vivian, and she watched something happen in her oldest friend's face that she had not seen in a very long time. Vivian's expression moved through recognition, then disbelief, then something that had no clean name, the specific expression of a person who has walked into a place they have never been and felt without explanation that they had been there before. Eleanor Marsh, Vivian said. Her voice had gone very quiet. Ruth waited. She was my grandmother's first cousin, Vivian said. On her mother's side. I only heard the name twice, maybe 3 times when I was young. Different branches. They'd lost touch long before I was born. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I never knew what Eleanor did with her life. Nobody in the family seemed to know. Ruth looked down at the journal in her hands, then at the small green plant growing against all reason near the far wall, then at the pipe running steady and quiet beneath the soil carrying water, the way it had carried water for 35 years faithfully, without anyone asking it to. She built this, Ruth said softly, and she built it to last without her. The words sat between them in the cold air of the greenhouse. Outside, October continued. The maple trees along the road shed their leaves in the wind. The town of Shelby Falls went about its morning unaware of 2 women standing inside a broken glass structure at its edge, holding a dead woman's journal, standing on soil that had no right to be alive. Ruth closed the journal carefully and held it against her chest. We stay, she said. Vivian looked around at the broken panels, the rusted frames, the cold ground, the impossible green of the single living plant. It's not a home, she said. Ruth looked at her. It was for Eleanor Marsh, and she built it to hold people. A long silence. Vivian exhaled. The breath was visible in the cold air, a small cloud that dissipated quickly and left nothing behind except the decision forming in the space between them. All right, Vivian said. We stay. Outside, the wind moved through the broken panels with a low, hollow sound. Not welcoming exactly, but not finished either. Like something that had been waiting a long time for someone to show up who was willing to see what it still had to offer. Ruth set the journal down carefully on the driest section of soil she could find. She looked around the greenhouse at the work that needed doing, at the space that needed clearing, at the system, running quietly beneath their feet, that had never stopped doing exactly what it was built to do. Then she picked up the piece of broken metal frame she had used to clear the soil and began to work. Vivian watched her for a moment. Then she found her own piece of metal and began to work beside her. That was how it started. Not with a plan, not with a speech, not with anything that could be written down or pointed to afterward as the moment everything changed. Just two women, old and cold and without a single thing left to lose, deciding that this broken place deserved someone willing to see what it could still become. The first night inside the greenhouse was the longest, not because of the cold, though the cold was real, not because of the discomfort, though the ground was hard and the darkness came early and settled completely once the last light left the sky. It was long because of the silence, the specific silence of two women who had spent the better part of 60 years filling rooms with the ordinary sounds of a shared life. The sounds of cooking and conversation, and the television left on too loud, and doors opening and closing at familiar hours now sitting in the dark. On a piece of folded tarp they had found beneath the collapsed section of the east wall, listening to October move through broken glass above them. Vivian spoke first. She usually did in the dark. "Tell me what you're thinking." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about the pipe." Vivian turned her head. Even in the darkness, after this many decades, they could read each other in outline. The pipe. The distribution system. If it was designed the way I think it was designed, there may be secondary lines running beneath the eastern section. That's where the soil holds moisture the longest. If those lines are still intact, Ruth, Vivian's voice was patient but firm. "I mean, what are you thinking about that you're not saying?" Ruth was quiet again. Longer this time. Outside, something small moved through the overgrowth along the fence line. A raccoon, probably. The wind had dropped and the night had gone very still. The kind of still that comes in the Ohio countryside when the temperature falls and even the insects have given up and gone somewhere else. "I'm thinking about the look on his face," Ruth said finally, "when I said Loretta's name." Vivian didn't respond immediately. He knew I saw it. He knew I understood what it meant. And he didn't deny it. Ruth's voice remained even, flat, surgical in its precision. "That's not the face of a man who made a decision. That's the face of a man who got managed into one." "Does that change anything?" "No," Ruth said. "Not right now. Maybe not ever. A managed decision is still a decision." She paused. "But it tells me something about what happened, and about what will happen next." Vivian considered this. Loretta will push him to follow through. Loretta will push him to do whatever she decides is necessary. She's been doing that for 20 years. I watched it and told myself I was misreading her. Ruth's jaw tightened slightly. I was not misreading her. Another silence. "Do you blame yourself," Vivian asked, "for raising a son who could be managed into something like this?" Ruth thought about it honestly. I blame myself for choosing not to see what was in front of me when you tried to show it to me. That's different from blaming myself for who he became." She shifted her weight on the folded tarp. "A parent builds the foundation. What a man puts on top of it at 58 is his own." Vivian was quiet for a while after that. Then very softly she said, "I should have pushed harder. When I told you about the loan paperwork, you changed the subject and I let you. You respected what I wanted. I let you believe something that wasn't true, because it was easier than watching you not believe me." Ruth turned to look at her friend's outline in the dark. "Vivian, I mean it. I know you do." Ruth's voice softened just slightly. "And I understand it. But the decision to believe what I believed was mine. You gave me the information. I put it down and walked away from it." She paused. "We don't get to trade that back and forth. I own it. You did what you could." The greenhouse settled around them. Somewhere in the pipes beneath the soil, water moved through the dark in its steady, patient way, the way it had moved for 35 years, without anyone listening. "What happens tomorrow?" Vivian asked. "Tomorrow," Ruth said, "we clear the east section." They worked for 3 days before anything grew. The first day was clearing. They moved debris with their hands, and with pieces of broken metal framing pushing aside the collapsed sections, stacking what was salvageable against the north wall, carrying out what was beyond use piece by piece through the gap in the fence. It was slow work. It was cold work. At 87 and 84, there was no efficiency of movement, no burst of energy, no working through discomfort without consequence. They stopped often. They sat on the overturned crate Vivian had found near the fence on the second morning. They drank water from a tap Ruth discovered on the exterior of the greenhouse's north face, still connected, still running cold and clean from a line that must have tied into the municipal supply at a depth the weather had never quite managed to reach. The second day was patching. Ruth had found beneath a section of collapsed shelving on the west wall a roll of heavy, clear plastic sheeting weathered at the edges but largely intact. They used it to cover the 4 largest gaps in the glass panels above the southern section, weighting the edges with pieces of metal frame and flat stones from outside the fence. The result was imperfect. The wind still moved through in places. The temperature inside rose by perhaps 4 degrees. 4 degrees mattered. The third day, Ruth planted. She had carried the seed packet from Eleanor Marsh's metal box in her coat pocket since the morning she found it. Small, plain brown paper envelope, the edges soft with age. Inside, when she opened it carefully, on the third morning, tomato seeds. A variety she didn't immediately recognize, smaller than the standard commercial seed, with a faint reddish tint to the hull that suggested an heirloom strain, something preserved deliberately over generations. Vivian watched her prepare the soil along the eastern section, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that watching Ruth work was a particular kind of witnessing. "Of all the things to plant," Vivian said, "they were always the hardest to keep alive," Ruth said, pressing the first seed into the damp earth. "Is that why?" Ruth looked up at her briefly. "That's exactly why." She planted 8 seeds in a careful line, spacing them with the precision of someone who had done this before, who understood that care in the beginning was not extra effort, but simply the first payment in a long negotiation with something alive. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at the dark soil over the seeds. "And if nothing comes up?" Vivian asked. Ruth brushed the dirt from her hands. "Then nothing comes up." Vivian studied her. "You sound prepared for that. I've lived long enough to know that not everything grows." Ruth stood slowly, using the metal frame for support. "But you plant anyway, because the alternative is deciding in advance that the ground is dead, and I've never been able to stomach that." On the fourth morning before Vivian woke, Ruth turned toward the eastern section and saw the first green line breaking through the soil. She did not move for a long moment. She simply looked at it from a distance of 4 feet. The way you look at something you have been told to expect, and somehow still find surprising when it arrives. Thin, fragile, unmistakable. "Vivian," she said, her voice barely above a breath. Vivian stirred. "What is it?" "Come here." There was a rustling, a careful shifting of weight. The sound of someone at 84, moving from sleep to standing with the deliberate caution that age requires. Then Vivian was beside her looking at the same thing. Neither of them spoke. "That wasn't there yesterday," Vivian said finally. "No." "Ruth, that's..." Vivian shook her head. "That's not a normal growth rate, from seed to sprout in 3 days in October." "No," Ruth said again. "It isn't." They both looked at the soil around the sprout, at the moisture in it darker and richer than it had any right to be at this time of year, in an unheated structure in Ohio. At the temperature which Ruth could feel on her face, warmer again this morning, warmer than yesterday, as though the greenhouse were slowly remembering what it was designed to do. "Eleanor's system," Vivian said softly. Ruth nodded. "The pipes are deeper than I thought. The heat exchange is keeping the root zone above freezing. The moisture distribution is consistent." She paused. She didn't just build a greenhouse. She built a controlled growing environment that works without electricity, without intervention, without anyone needing to maintain it daily. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She knew she wouldn't always be here. She planned for exactly that." They stood beside the small green line in the soil for a while longer, saying nothing because some things are more honestly held in silence than in words. By the end of the second week, the change was undeniable. Not one sprout, but 7. Not fragile, but strong, growing at a rate that Ruth had no entirely satisfying explanation for and had stopped trying to explain completely. The leaves that emerged were a deep, particular green, the green of something that was not merely surviving in difficult conditions, but somehow thriving in them, as though Eleanor Marsh's soil, and Eleanor Marsh's water, and Eleanor Marsh's glass and metal architecture had been waiting 35 years for someone to put seeds in the ground and stand back. Vivian checked them every morning before Ruth woke. Ruth would open her eyes and find Vivian already crouched at the edge of the eastern section, looking at the plants with an expression Ruth hadn't seen on her face in years. "They grew again," Vivian said one morning, and her voice carried something new, not just observation. Something that lived below observation. Something that required a different word. Hope was close. But it wasn't quite hope. Hope implies uncertainty. This was more like recognition. like remembering something she had known before and set down somewhere and not been able to find. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for the plants, checking, adjusting, clearing whatever debris the night wind had shifted. Afternoons were for the structure, reinforcing what needed reinforcing, patching what could be patched, finding in the debris of the collapsed sections things that could still be used. Evenings were for the journal. Ruth read Eleanor Marsh's words the way she had always read things that mattered, slowly, with attention to what was said between the lines as much as what was written on them. Eleanor had been methodical. She had documented everything: soil temperatures, growth rates, the behavior of the underground pipe system through seasonal changes, the community members who had come and what they had brought and what they had taken away. She had written about the city grant that funded the greenhouse, the account number attached to the water supply, the legal framework she had tried and failed to establish before the city withdrew its support, and in her final entries the fear she would not say outright, but could not keep from showing between the lines, that what she had built for everyone would eventually become something for no one. Ruth read those entries more than once. The first person came on a Wednesday. Ruth heard her before she saw her careful footsteps on the gravel outside the fence. Then a pause, then a voice. "Hello." Ruth went to the entrance. A woman in her mid-60s stood just outside, her coat worn and clean, her expression caught between apology and something more urgent. "I heard," the woman said, and then stopped as though she hadn't decided how to finish the sentence. Ruth waited. "Someone at the church said there might be vegetables here. Fresh ones." The woman's eyes moved past Ruth to the interior of the greenhouse. "I don't have much to offer in trade, but I can—" "You don't need to trade," Ruth said. The woman looked at her. "I'm sorry." Ruth turned, picked up the small basket she had assembled that morning. 6 tomatoes, a handful of herbs that had appeared along the northern section without being planted, things growing from seeds already in Eleanor's soil, and brought it to the woman. The woman stared at the basket, then at Ruth. Her shoulders dropped in a way that said more than any sentence she could have assembled. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was unsteady. She turned to go, then paused. "They're talking about this place," she said. "People have noticed." Ruth said nothing. "I don't know if that's good or bad for you," the woman added. "I just thought you should know." Ruth watched her walk back toward the road. Vivian appeared at her shoulder. "Who was she?" Vivian asked. "Someone who needed something," Ruth said. More people came. Not many at first. 1, then 2. Then a small handful across the following week, arriving individually and at varying hours of the day, drawn by word passed quietly through a community that had developed the habit of noting where things appeared that had not been there before. A man who had not eaten fresh food in weeks. An older couple who remembered when Shelby Falls had a working community garden and stood at the edge of the space with the particular expression of people revisiting something they had mourned without ceremony. A younger man who asked no questions received a small bag of vegetables without explanation and came back 2 days later with a hammer and a box of screws and spent 4 hours repairing the west section of metal framing without being asked. Vivian watched it accumulate, standing near the entrance each time someone came, her arms sometimes crossed, her expression moving through caution and surprise and something that kept resisting the name she tried to give it. "They're not just coming for the food," she said one evening. Ruth looked up from the soil. "No. Then what are they coming for?" Ruth looked around the greenhouse, at the plants, at the warmth that persisted inside when the October air outside had dropped another 5 degrees, at the repaired section of west framing, at the cleared paths and the patched panels and the visible evidence of two women deciding against all reasonable expectation that a broken place was worth tending. "They're coming for this," Ruth said. "For what this is." Vivian frowned slightly. "What is it?" Ruth considered the question. "A place that's still trying," she said. Hargrove came on a Thursday morning 12 days after they arrived. He came alone the first time, which Ruth noted. A man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the specific way of someone whose clothes communicate a position rather than a preference. Dark wool overcoat, shoes that had no business being anywhere near an unpaved lot. He stood outside the fence line for a moment, looking at the greenhouse with the expression of someone doing a calculation. Then he came through the gap in the fence without being invited. Ruth was at the east section when she heard him. She stood up and turned around and looked at him across the length of the greenhouse without speaking. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "My name is Hargrove. I represent Meridian Property Group." Ruth said nothing. He produced a business card and held it out. Ruth didn't move toward it. He placed it on the nearest flat surface, a piece of metal frame, and put his hands back in his coat pockets. "I'll be direct with you. This land has come under review for development, residential and commercial expansion. The area has significant potential." "No one thought so before last week," Ruth said. Hargrove smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind that had been deployed in many rooms and refined over many years. These things move in cycles. Value is discovered, then acted upon. That's simply how it works. "What do you want?" "I want to make this easy for you." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Clean white edges, substantial weight. He set it beside the business card. "There's a relocation package inside. Temporary housing financial assistance. Enough to ensure you're comfortable while you find a more suitable—" "We're not looking for anything more suitable," Ruth said. Hargrove's smile held. "I understand the attachment. Truly. But this isn't a sustainable situation. Two women this age in an unheated structure." "It's heated," Ruth said. He paused, looked around at the greenhouse with a brief involuntary assessment. "Regardless, the legal situation here is straightforward. This is private land. You don't have a claim to it." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Whose land is it?" A fraction of a pause. "Ownership is in the process of being finalized." "Then it's not yours yet." Another pause. Longer. The professional smile remained, but something shifted in the eyes above it. "Mrs. Calloway, I'd encourage you to consider the offer seriously. It's generous. It's meant to be." "I'm sure it is." Ruth turned back to the east section. "Thank you for coming." She heard him stand there for another moment. She did not turn around. Eventually, she heard his footsteps moving back toward the fence. He did not take his business card with him. Vivian appeared from the northern section where she had been listening without pretending not to. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Ruth said. "He will. With more. Probably." Vivian looked at the envelope on the metal frame. "Are you going to open it?" Ruth didn't look at it. Not today. He came back 6 days later. This time with a second man, younger, quieter, carrying a folder of documents that he kept consulting without reading aloud. The offer in the new envelope was larger. Ruth could tell by the weight of it. She held it in both hands for a moment. Feeling the weight, then set it down on the same flat surface where the first one had sat. "We're not leaving," she said. Hargrove's professional composure had thinned slightly at the edges. Not gone. Just slightly less perfect than it had been the first time. "I want you to understand that this process will move forward regardless." "The legal framework." "What legal framework?" Ruth asked. "You've told me twice that ownership is being finalized. That means it isn't final. Which means the ground we're standing on has a question attached to it." Hargrove looked at her. "These questions resolve. In whose favor?" He didn't answer. Ruth looked at the folder in the younger man's hands. "What's in there?" Hargrove hesitated. "Documentation relevant to the acquisition." "Show me." Another hesitation. The younger man glanced at Hargrove. Hargrove gave a small, controlled shake of his head. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I know what you're trying to do," Ruth said. Her voice had not changed volume or temperature. It never did. But something in it had clarified in the way a sky clarifies before serious weather. "And I want you to understand something. I spent 30 years as a nurse. I have held the hands of people in the last hours of their lives. I've sat with families when the news was the worst possible news. I have not, in all of that time, met a person who was made better by someone deciding for them what they could and could not handle." She looked at him directly. "I can handle whatever is in that folder. What I won't do is make a decision based on information I haven't been allowed to see." Hargrove said nothing for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the fence. At the gap, he stopped without turning around. "This isn't the last conversation we'll have about this." "I know," Ruth said. When he was gone, Vivian let out a long breath. "You know he'll come back with something harder." "Yes. And we won't have an answer for it." "We might." Ruth looked down at the soil. "I need to look at that journal more carefully. Eleanor built this in 1989, and she called it Shelby Community Garden. That name is on the sign. It didn't come from nowhere. She read the journal that night by the light of a small battery lantern Vivian had found in the debris of the west section, still functional, still carrying half a charge. She read it carefully, the way she read everything. Not for what the words said on the surface, but for what they said about the person who wrote them. Eleanor Marsh had been a landscape architect. She had worked for the city of Shelby Falls for 11 years before retiring in 1987. She had designed 3 public parks, 2 schoolyard renovations, and a riverfront restoration project that had taken 4 years and considerable political friction to complete. She had opinions about soil pH and drainage gradients and the specific needs of heirloom tomato varieties in the Ohio climate. She had written them all down with the same unhurried precision she had used for everything else. In 1988, she had applied to the city council for a grant to establish a community garden on a parcel of land at the eastern edge of Shelby Falls. The parcel had been decommissioned from agricultural use in 1979 and had sat empty since. The grant was approved in March of 1989. Construction began in April. The greenhouse opened in September of the same year. Eleanor had documented the opening. 43 people came the first day. I had expected fewer. They brought nothing, which is exactly right. A place like this should ask nothing of people at the beginning. It earns the right to ask things over time, as trust is built. Ruth read that sentence twice. She kept reading. The journal covered 3 years of the garden's operation. Detailed records of what was planted, and what grew, and what failed, and why. Notes on the community, the regulars, the occasional visitors, the people who came once in a moment of need and never returned. Notes on the underground system, including a hand-drawn diagram that showed the pipe network in detail. The collection points, the distribution lines, the secondary channels beneath the eastern section, exactly where Ruth had suspected them. And then in the final entries, a shift in tone. The city has cut the maintenance budget for the 3rd consecutive year. I have been subsidizing the operating costs from my own savings. I am 61 years old, and I am not a wealthy woman. I have perhaps 2 more years of this before the numbers stop working. But the system doesn't need me to keep working. That is why I built it the way I built it. The pipes will flow. The soil will hold. If someone comes along after me who is willing to plant, the garden will respond. I'm not afraid of being gone. I am only afraid of the garden being used as something other than what it is. It was built for everyone. That has to mean something legally. I don't know how to make it mean something legally. I hope someone someday will know how. Ruth set the journal down. She looked at the metal box, at the seeds from Eleanor's packet now growing in the eastern section, with no sensible explanation for their vigor, at the pipe network running beneath her feet in the dark. Eleanor Marsh had been trying to protect this place for 35 years. She had built the protection into the physical structure of it, into the soil, into the water system. She had written it down and sealed it in a metal box and buried it in the ground and hoped. Ruth thought about what Eleanor had written. I hope someone someday will know how. She looked at the journal for another long moment. Then she picked it up and put it carefully inside her coat against her chest, where it would be warm. Gideon came on a Friday. Ruth saw him first. He came through the gap in the fence without hesitation, dressed in the same dark jacket he had worn on the porch. He moved through the greenhouse with the particular purposefulness of someone who had rehearsed the reason for being there and intended to deliver it efficiently. But Ruth saw him before he saw her, and in the 3 seconds before he registered her presence, she watched him look around the greenhouse, at the plants, at the repaired framing, at the cleared paths, and the patched panels and the small community of things growing against the October logic of Ohio weather. Something moved in his face in those 3 seconds. She couldn't fully read it. It was gone before she had enough of it. "Mom," he said. Ruth was standing very still at the eastern section, her hands at her sides. Vivian was in the northern section. Ruth heard Vivian stop moving. "Gideon," Ruth said. He came toward her and stopped at a reasonable distance. Not close enough to touch, not far enough to be symbolic about the distance. The exact middle ground of a man who has told himself this is a business conversation and is trying to keep it in that category. "I need you to understand something about how this is going to go," he said. Ruth waited. The property situation is further along than you might realize. There are parties involved, investors, development timelines, legal commitments that were made based on the assumption that this land would be clear. He paused. What you're doing here is complicating something that's already in motion. Ruth looked at her son. Who sent you? Gideon's jaw tightened. I'm here because who sent you, Gideon? A beat. 1 second. Hargrove reached out. We have a mutual interest in resolving this cleanly. Vivian came around the corner of the northern section and stopped when she saw Gideon. She looked at him steadily. Then she looked at Ruth. Ruth nodded once. Vivian said, How long have you been working with them? Gideon turned toward her. I'm not working with anyone. I'm trying to... How long? Ruth asked. He stopped. His hands had gone into his pockets, the same thing he did at every hard moment, the body's private way of managing what the mind was struggling to hold. She had noticed it in him since he was a teenager, standing in the kitchen trying to explain something he'd broken. Since the summer, he said. Ruth said nothing. They approached me in June. They had already identified the land. They knew about the community garden history. They knew the parcel was tied to a property transfer that had just gone through, and they... He stopped, pressed his lips together. They made an offer. On the land. A good offer. How good? Ruth asked. He told her the number. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's Loretta's money now. Gideon flinched. It was small and fast, and he recovered quickly. But she saw it. The house was sold to fund the land purchase, he said. His voice had gone flat with the effort of saying it plainly. The land purchase funded the arrangement with Meridian. It's a single transaction structured over several months. Ruth absorbed this. She let it sit inside her without reacting to it the way she had learned to let difficult information sit, feeling its full weight before deciding what to do with the weight. You used the money from my home, she said, to buy the ground I'm standing on. Gideon said nothing. And then you sold it. Still nothing. And now you're here to ask me to leave the thing you bought with what you took from me. The greenhouse was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the broken panels with its low, hollow sound. Inside, the plants stood in their rows, green and steady and absurdly alive. Gideon looked at the ground. Mom, I... Don't, Ruth said. Not harshly, but finally. He fell silent. You told me on the porch that I should figure something out, Ruth said. I did. This is what I figured out. She gestured around the greenhouse, not dramatically, just indicating the space, the work, the living proof of what two old women with nothing had done with a broken place and a dead woman's system of pipes. I'm not leaving it. Gideon looked up at her then, and this time the thing in his face stayed long enough to read. It was not guilt exactly. It was something more complicated than guilt. Something that lived in the specific territory between knowing something is wrong and having already traveled too far down the road that led to it. You don't understand what's at stake legally, he said. If you stay, Hargrove will escalate. There are processes. Vivian spoke, then her voice level and certain in the way it got when she had been holding something and had decided to set it down. That's what she told you, isn't it? That this was the only way out. The only option you had. Gideon turned toward her sharply. Loretta, Vivian said. Not a question. A long silence. "It's never the only way," Ruth said. "You know that." Gideon looked at his mother, his own face carrying the specific weight of a 58-year-old man who made a decision he cannot walk back, standing in front of the woman who taught him the difference between a decision and a surrender. "I can't undo it," he said. "I know," Ruth said. "Then what do you want from me?" Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Nothing right now." It was not cruelty. It was not forgiveness. It was simply the truth of the moment, stated plainly by a woman who had learned over 87 years that some things cannot be resolved in a single conversation, and that pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. Gideon stood there for another moment. Then he turned and walked back through the greenhouse, through the gap in the fence, and disappeared toward the road. Ruth stood very still for a long time after he was gone. Vivian came to stand beside her. She didn't speak. She simply stood close enough that their arms were almost touching in the way she had stood beside Ruth through every hard thing for 60 years. The plants in the eastern section caught the afternoon light, green and full of a life that no reasonable assessment of the situation would have predicted. Ruth reached down and worked the soil at the base of the nearest plant, loosening the earth around the root, checking, tending. The work that needed doing done. She stood up. She went back to work. 3 days after Gideon left, the second envelope arrived. Not delivered by hand this time. Left at the gap in the fence in the early morning before Ruth and Vivian were awake, weighted down by a flat stone so the October wind wouldn't take it. Ruth found it when she went out to check the exterior water tap at first light. She stood in the cold, holding it for a moment, feeling the weight of it before she brought it inside. She set it on the metal frame without opening it. Vivian saw it when she woke. She looked at it, then at Ruth, then back at it. "Heavier than the last one," she said. "Yes." "Are you going to open it?" Ruth looked at it for a long moment. "Later," she said. And she went to check the plants. She opened it that evening when the light had gone, and the lantern was on, and the greenhouse had settled into its nighttime quiet. She unfolded the document inside, slowly reading each line with the same careful attention she had given Eleanor's journal. Vivian sat across from her on the overturned crate, watching her face. The number was substantial, more than substantial. Ruth read it twice, then set the paper down on her knee and looked at the lantern flame for a moment. Vivian leaned forward. "How much?" Ruth told her. Vivian was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, with the honesty that came from 60 years of never lying to each other about the things that mattered, "Ruth, that's enough." "I know. That's enough for both of us. For the rest of our lives." Vivian's voice was careful, not pushing, just true. Heat. A real bed. A place where no one can come through a gap in a fence and tell us to leave. Safety. She paused. At our age, safety means something different than it used to. Ruth folded the paper once precisely along the original crease. "I know what it means." "Then why don't you look relieved?" Ruth set the folded paper on the metal frame beside her and looked at her oldest friend. At the face she had known for 60 years, mapped now with the specific geography of a long life. Every line earned every shadow, a record of something real. Vivian was not pushing her. Vivian was never pushing her. Vivian was simply saying the thing that needed to be said, because that was what they had always done for each other. "Because relief isn't what I feel," Ruth said. "Then what do you feel?" Ruth looked around the greenhouse, at the plants in their rows, green and steady in the lantern light, at the patch panels above them, imperfect and sufficient, at the repaired framing on the west wall where a man she barely knew had spent an afternoon working without being asked, at the small pile of things people had brought and left near the entrance: a hand tool, a bag of mulch, a folded note from the woman who had come first, the woman with the worn coat that said simply, "Thank you for being here." "I feel like I know what this is," Ruth said, "and I feel like they're offering me money to stop knowing it." Vivian looked down at her own hands. "That's not the same thing as the offer being wrong." "No," Ruth agreed. "It isn't." A long silence. The water moved beneath them in its pipes. The lantern flickered once and steadied. "Say what you want to say," Vivian told her. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I want to stay." Vivian nodded slowly. "I know. That's not a decision I can make for both of us." Vivian looked up. "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember what this place looked like when we walked in?" "Yes." "And do you remember what you said? You said Eleanor built it to hold people." Vivian looked around the greenhouse, the same slow survey Ruth had just made, taking in the same evidence of the same accumulation of small decisions and small dignities. "It's holding us," she said, "and it's starting to hold others." Ruth waited. "If we take the money," Vivian said carefully, "this becomes a parking lot, or a row of houses with two-car garages and nobody knowing each other's names." She paused. "If we stay, it gets harder," Ruth said. Vivian almost smiled. "You said that before." "It's still true." "Yes." Vivian exhaled. "It is." She looked at the folded paper on the metal frame. Then she stood slowly with the deliberate care of someone who has decided something and is acting on it before the decision can be reconsidered. She picked up the envelope and the folded paper and walked to the entrance of the greenhouse where the night air came through the gap in the fence in a thin, cold stream. She set them both down on a flat stone just inside the entrance. Not thrown, not torn, not rejected in anger or ceremony, just set down. A thing put aside with the quiet finality of someone who has decided it belongs in a different category from the things she is keeping. She came back and sat down on the crate. "All right," she said. "We stay." Ruth looked at her. "Vivian." "Don't," Vivian said. And she said it with exactly the same tone Ruth had used with Gideon, carrying the same weight, the same finality, the same love underneath it. "We stay. That's settled. Now tell me about the journal." Ruth had been thinking about Eleanor's final entry for 4 days. "I hope someone someday will know how." She spread the hand-drawn diagram from the journal on the flat piece of metal framing they used as a table, weighting the corners with stones. The diagram showed the pipe network in detail, the collection points along the roofline, the main distribution channel running north to south, beneath the center of the greenhouse floor. the secondary lines branching east and west, the connection point where the system tied into what Eleanor had labeled Municipal Supply Line Shelby Community Garden City. Account number CG-1989-447. Ruth had stared at that notation for a long time before she understood what it meant. The water system was not just connected to the municipal supply. It was connected through a city account. A city account opened in 1989 and apparently never closed. Still flowing, still charged to an account number that had existed for 35 years. Because no one had ever filed the paperwork to close it. The city has been paying the water bill for this greenhouse for 35 years, she told Vivian. Vivian stared at her. That's not possible. It's a small line item, automated. No one has looked at it because no one has had a reason to look at it. Ruth's finger traced the diagram. But it means the city of Shelby Falls has been maintaining a financial relationship with this property for 35 years. That's not ownership, but it's something. What's something? Ruth picked up the journal and turned to Eleanor's first entry. Applied to the city council for a grant to establish a community garden on a parcel of land at the eastern edge of Shelby Falls. The grant was approved in March of 1989. Eleanor got a city grant, Ruth said. The garden was built on city-approved land with city funds. The account was never closed. The water has been running on city money since 1989. She looked at Vivian. That parcel was never fully privatized. Meridian's acquisition, whatever Hargrove says about it being finalized, may have a serious problem. Vivian sat with this. Hargrove said ownership was being finalized. He said it twice. Both times I asked him whose land it was, he didn't answer directly. Because the answer is complicated. Because the answer might not be what he needs it to be. Vivian leaned over the diagram. How do you prove any of this? Ruth looked at the journal, at Eleanor's handwriting, at the city account number, at the diagram drawn by a landscape architect who had understood that the legal protection she couldn't provide in life, she might be able to leave buried in the ground. Eleanor left everything we need, Ruth said quietly. She knew she couldn't fight it herself. So she documented it. She sealed the documentation and buried it and waited for someone to find it. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she waited 35 years. Yes. She waited for someone who was willing to look. Ruth held the journal for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the 35 years compressed into its warped leather cover. And now we have to figure out how to use what she left. Stellan Marsh came on a Tuesday, and he came because of the tomatoes. He was 36 years old, tall and angular in the way of someone who had been thin all his life, with the specific bearing of a man who had grown up without money and learned early that precision of thought was a resource that cost nothing and could accomplish a great deal. He had received a bag of tomatoes from a neighbor who had received them from the woman with the worn coat, and he had come to the greenhouse with a question he didn't know how to ask yet. He stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the space, the plants, the repairs, the two old women who looked at him with the unhurried assessment of people who have nothing left to prove and therefore nothing to lose in the looking. I'm a lawyer, he said, and I think I might know something useful to you. Ruth looked at him steadily. What kind of lawyer? Property and land use. He paused. I grew up here, in Shelby Falls. My grandmother used to talk about this place. She said her family helped plant the first season in 1989. He stopped. Her name was Margaret Marsh. Her aunt, her mother's sister, was the woman who built this garden. Vivian made a small sound. Ruth glanced at her. Eleanor Marsh built this garden. Vivian said carefully, her voice carrying something private. Stellan nodded. Eleanor was my grandmother Margaret's aunt. I never met Eleanor. She died before I was born. He looked around the greenhouse. I didn't know this place still existed until I started hearing about it 3 weeks ago. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to where she kept the journal inside her coat when she was moving under a folded piece of plastic sheeting when she was not. And she brought it out and held it toward him. He took it with the careful hands of someone who understood what he was holding. He opened it to the first page and read Eleanor's opening line, and something moved in his face that was private and real, and that Ruth chose not to examine. He looked up. Where did you find this? Buried in the floor, Ruth said, with a diagram of the water system and a city account number. She watched him process that. She watched the lawyer, part of his mind, engage the shift from personal to analytical, the reorganization of information into legal categories, the recognition of something that mattered. CG-1989-447, she said. He went very still. Say that again. She said it again. He was quiet for 30 seconds, long enough that Vivian looked at Ruth with a question in her eyes. Ruth shook her head slightly. Wait, there was a city council audit 2 years ago, Stellan said. Public records. I looked at it for a different case. There were 17 dormant accounts flagged for review accounts that had been running automated for more than 10 years without a current responsible party attached to them. He looked at Ruth. One of them was a community garden account. I remember it because the amount was small enough that nobody thought it was worth pursuing. The water was still running. The account was still attached to a physical address. He paused. I didn't connect it to this location because I didn't know this location still existed. Ruth pointed to the diagram. Eleanor connected the water system to that account intentionally. She knew if the account stayed open, the city retained an ongoing interest in the property. Stellan leaned over the diagram. His jaw tightened in the particular way of someone managing a strong feeling through concentration on facts. This is a legal argument, he said. Not a guaranteed one, but it's a real one. He straightened. Meridian's acquisition of this parcel, do you know who sold it to them? Ruth looked at him directly. My son. A beat. And how did your son? He acquired it with funds from the sale of my home. A sale that was executed using documents I signed under conditions that I was not fully informed of. She paused. I signed what I was told were insurance documents following cardiac surgery. Among them was a property transfer authorization. Stellan was very still. You have documentation of this? Not in my possession currently. He nodded slowly. His hands were controlled the hands of someone who had learned to manage the physical expressions of anger. Mrs. Calloway, what I'm hearing is potentially 2 separate legal issues. The fraudulent transfer of your home and the potentially invalid sale of this parcel to Meridian, given the city's ongoing financial interest in the property. Yes, Ruth said. I want to help. Ruth looked at him. The young man whose great-great-aunt had planted seeds in soil that had waited 35 years. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, not for what was on the surface, but for what was underneath. "Why?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Because Eleanor built something for everyone, and someone took it away from everyone. And that's wrong." He paused. "And because you planted something in ground that had no business growing anything and it grew. And that tells me something about what kind of person you are." Another pause. "And because I've been a property lawyer for 8 years helping people with money, protect what they have, and I would like at least once to do something different." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." He sat. She told him everything. Hargrove came back on a Thursday with 4 people instead of 2, and documents instead of envelopes. Ruth was ready. She stood at the entrance of the greenhouse when he came through the fence, and she was not alone. The woman with the worn coat was there. Her name was Darlene. Ruth had learned a retired schoolteacher who lived 3 blocks from the greenhouse on a fixed income that had been stretched by the previous winter's heating bills. The man who had repaired the west framing was there. His name was Gordon, 62 years old, a former contractor between work coming to the greenhouse every other day for 3 weeks. Because as he had told Vivian, simply it felt like the right place to be. 4 others stood in a loose grouping near the northern section. People who had come for vegetables and stayed for something harder to name. Hargrove looked at the assembled people. His professional composure held, but Ruth saw him recalibrate. This was not what he had expected. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I think it would be better to have this conversation privately." "There's no private here," Ruth said. "This is a community space." Hargrove's mouth tightened slightly. "The legal status of this space is precisely what we're here to discuss." He gestured to the man beside him who opened a folder and produced a document. "We have a completed deed of purchase for this parcel executed through proper legal channels, signed and recorded with the county." "Who signed it?" Ruth asked. "The seller of record." "I'd like the name." A pause. "Gideon Calloway." "And how did Gideon Calloway come to own this parcel?" Another pause. "That's a matter between—" "He bought it," Ruth said, "with money from the sale of my home. A sale executed using a document I signed under surgical sedation, without adequate disclosure of its contents." She reached into her coat and produced the copy Stellan had made of Eleanor's journal. The diagram and the city account documentation, holding them clearly visible. "Additionally, this parcel has been maintained under a city account number CG-1989-447 since 1989, constituting an ongoing municipal interest in the property that was not disclosed at the time of sale, and that may constitute grounds for invalidating the transfer." The folder in the other man's hands had gone very still. Hargrove looked at the documents Ruth was holding. He looked at them the way a professional looks at something that requires reassessment. His expression not changing dramatically, but reorganizing internally in a way Ruth recognized. She had seen it in hospitals. The moment when someone realizes the situation is different from what the charts indicated. "Where did you get those?" he asked. "From the ground," Ruth said. "The woman who built this greenhouse buried them here in 1989. She knew someone would need them." Darlene, standing to Ruth's left, said quietly, "My mother came to this garden in 1991. She brought me here when I was 12 years old. I remember the sign on the fence. I remember what this place was." She looked at Hargrove directly. It was for everyone then. It should be for everyone now, Gordon said from Ruth's right. I've been coming here for 3 weeks. I've watched 2 women over 80 rebuild a growing system from nothing. I've watched people come here who had nowhere else to go. I've watched things grow that shouldn't be able to grow. He paused. I don't know a lot about property law, but I know what a community looks like when it's working, and I know what it looks like when someone's trying to end it for money. Hargrove looked at the group, then at Ruth. Something moved behind his professional composure. A slight pressure like a pipe with more flow than it was designed for. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I want you to understand what you're setting in motion. A legal challenge of this nature will take months, possibly longer. It will be expensive and... I have a lawyer, Ruth said. A beat. Who? Stellan Marsh, she said. Eleanor Marsh's great-nephew. Something shifted in Hargrove's face at that name. Something small and fast that told Ruth the name was not unknown to him, that Stellan's professional reputation preceded him in ways that mattered in rooms where property decisions were made. He stood there for a moment, the documents in his associate's folder, the documents in Ruth's hands. The people around her not aggressive, not loud, simply present in the specific way that presence becomes its own argument. Then he said, We'll be in contact with your counsel. And he walked back through the fence. Ruth watched him go. She watched both cars pull away from the road outside and disappear in the direction of the highway. She stood very still until the sound of the engines was fully gone. Then Darlene put her hand on Ruth's arm lightly. Are you all right? Ruth looked at her. At the question in her face, genuine and careful, and carrying the particular quality of concern from someone who has their own struggles and still has capacity to worry about someone else's. Yes, Ruth said, I am. And she meant it. 3 days after Hargrove's visit, the third envelope arrived, not delivered by hand this time. Left at the gap in the fence in the early morning before Ruth and Vivian were awake, weighted down by a flat stone, so the November wind wouldn't take it. Ruth found it when she went out to check the exterior water tap at first light. She stood in the cold, holding it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, before she brought it inside. She set it on the metal frame without opening it. Vivian saw it when she woke. She looked at it, then at Ruth, then back at it. Heavier than the last one, she said. Yes. Are you going to open it? Ruth looked at it for a long moment. Later, she said. And she went to check the plants. She opened it that evening when the light had gone and the lantern was on and the greenhouse had settled into its nighttime quiet. She unfolded the document inside, slowly reading each line with the same careful attention she had given Eleanor's journal. Vivian sat across from her on the overturned crate, watching her face. The number was substantial. More than substantial. Ruth read it twice, then set the paper down on her knee and looked at the lantern flame for a moment. Vivian leaned forward. How much? Ruth told her. Vivian was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, with the honesty that came from 60 years of never lying to each other, about the things that mattered, Ruth, that's enough. I know. That's enough for both of us, for the rest of our lives. Vivian's voice was careful, not pushing, just true. Heat. A real bed. a place where no one can come through a gap in a fence and tell us to leave. Safety. She paused. At our age, safety means something different than it used to. Ruth folded the paper once precisely along the original crease. I know what it means. Then why don't you look relieved? Ruth set the folded paper on the metal frame beside her and looked at her oldest friend. At the face she had known for 60 years, mapped now with the specific geography of a long life, every line earned, every shadow, a record of something real. Vivian was not pushing her. Vivian was never pushing her. Vivian was simply saying the thing that needed to be said, because that was what they had always done for each other. Because relief isn't what I feel, Ruth said. Then what do you feel? Ruth looked around the greenhouse, at the plants in their rows, green and steady in the lantern light, at the patch panels above them, imperfect and sufficient, at the repaired framing on the west wall where Gordon had spent an afternoon working without being asked, at the small pile of things people had brought and left near the entrance, a hand tool, a bag of mulch, a folded note from Darlene that said, simply, "Thank you for being here." I feel like I know what this is, Ruth said, and I feel like they're offering me money to stop knowing it. Vivian looked down at her own hands. That's not the same thing as the offer being wrong. No, Ruth agreed. It isn't. A long silence. The water moved beneath them in its pipes. The lantern flickered once and steadied. Say what you want to say, Vivian told her. Ruth was quiet for a moment. I want to stay. Vivian nodded slowly. I know. That's not a decision I can make for both of us. Vivian looked up. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, do you remember what this place looked like when we walked in? Yes. And do you remember what you said? You said Eleanor built it to hold people. Vivian looked around the greenhouse, the same slow survey Ruth had just made. It's holding us, and it's holding others now, too. Ruth waited. If we take the money, Vivian said carefully, this becomes a parking lot, or a row of houses with 2-car garages and nobody knowing each other's names. She paused. If we stay, it gets harder, Ruth said. Vivian almost smiled. You said that before. It's still true. Yes. Vivian exhaled. She looked at the folded paper on the metal frame. Then she stood slowly with the deliberate care of someone who has decided something and is acting on it before the decision can be reconsidered. She picked up the envelope and the folded paper and walked to the entrance of the greenhouse, where the night air came through the gap in the fence in a thin, cold stream. She set them both down on a flat stone just inside the entrance. Not thrown, not torn, not rejected in anger or ceremony, just set down. A thing put aside with the quiet finality of someone who has decided it belongs in a different category from the things she is keeping. She came back and sat down on the crate. All right, she said. We stay. Stellan filed the initial documentation on a Friday. He did it pro bono, working from his office 3 miles away and from the greenhouse floor in the evenings, surrounded by Eleanor's journal and the city records he had pulled through channels that took 4 days and 2 formal requests to open. The argument was not simple. Property law rarely was. But the structure of it was clear. An ongoing municipal financial interest never formally dissolved, attached to a parcel that had been sold without disclosure of that interest. A property transfer executed using authorization obtained through incomplete informed consent. Two separate threads, each of them real, each of them requiring the other to be fully persuasive. "It's not a guaranteed outcome," Stellan told Ruth, sitting on the overturned crate with his laptop balanced on a flat piece of metal frame. "I want to be clear about that." "I understand," Ruth said. "Nothing is guaranteed. Meridian has resources and established relationships with the county. Outcomes in property disputes often reflect those kinds of asymmetries." "I've worked in medicine for 30 years, Ruth said. "I know what asymmetries look like. You work the case you have with the information you have, and you see where it goes." Stellan looked at her over the top of his laptop. "You're not worried." Ruth thought about it honestly. "I'm worried about the right things," she said. "I'm not worried about things I can't control." He nodded slowly. "What are you worried about?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "That Gideon will get hurt in ways he doesn't deserve," she said. "Even after everything." Stellan said nothing for a moment. Then, carefully, "The fraudulent transfer documentation to make the strongest case I would need to demonstrate that the signing of the property authorization was done without adequate disclosure. The original hospital documents would be significant. Do you have any access to those?" "No," Ruth said. "Gideon has the originals, or Loretta does." Stellan nodded. He wrote something down. He didn't say anything else about it. It was on a Tuesday evening, 9 days after Stellan filed, that the phone call came. Ruth was at the eastern section when she heard it, the small phone Stellan had rigged to the exterior water line set on a flat stone near the entrance. She went to it and answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Controlled. Precise. The voice of someone who had decided what she was gonna say and had arranged the words in advance. "Mrs. Calloway, this is Loretta." Ruth said nothing. "I want you to understand something," Loretta continued. "What happened with the house was a financial decision. It was not personal. Gideon and I are in a position that required certain actions, and those actions were taken legally." Ruth looked out through the broken glass panels at the November sky, pale gray and still. "Loretta," she said, "why are you calling?" A brief pause. "Because Gideon won't. And because someone needs to tell you that continuing to fight this will cost you more than the offer we've made. The legal process will exhaust whatever resources you have. You're 87 years old. You had heart surgery 6 months ago." Another pause, shorter. "Take the money. Find somewhere comfortable. Stop this." Ruth considered the voice on the phone, the precision of it, the complete absence of anything that resembled uncertainty. She thought about the woman who had stood at her hospital bedside in March holding a clipboard and smiling, and she understood with the clarity that came from having nothing left to protect, except the truth, exactly what kind of person she was listening to. "Loretta," Ruth said, "I want you to hear this clearly." "I'm listening." "I spent 30 years as a nurse. I watched people face the worst moments of their lives. The ones who survived them, not just physically, but as themselves, were the ones who stayed true to what they knew was real, when everything around them said otherwise." Ruth's voice was even. "I know what this place is. I know what Eleanor Marsh built it for, and I know what your husband did and why." She paused. "The offer is generous. The answer is no." Silence. "You're making a mistake there," Loretta said. "I've made mistakes," Ruth said. "I know what they feel like. This isn't one of them." She ended the call. She set the phone down on the flat stone. She stood outside in the November cold for a moment, looking at the greenhouse behind her, the sign they had cleaned and remounted: Shelby Community Garden, established 1989. Vivian had insisted on repainting the letters. She had done it herself, slowly with a small brush, while Gordon held the sign steady. Then she went back inside and returned to the east section and continued her work. Gideon came back on a night in early November. The temperature had dropped into the 30s. Inside the greenhouse, Eleanor's system held the soil zone above freezing with the same patient consistency it had maintained for 35 years. But the air was cold enough now that Ruth and Vivian slept in their coats and kept the lantern burning through the night for the marginal warmth it provided. Ruth heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the gravel, then the familiar sound of the fence gap being navigated. She sat up and waited. He came in alone. No jacket this time, just a heavy flannel shirt, and the cold coming off him like something he'd been carrying a long distance. He was holding a manila envelope, not the clean white envelopes of Hargrove's world, but a plain working envelope thick with papers handled enough that the corners had softened. He stopped inside the entrance and looked around in the greenhouse, the way he had looked around it the last time: the plants, the repairs, the evidence of what this place had become. This time Ruth watched his face for longer. This time the thing she saw there stayed long enough to read completely. It was grief. Specific and private, and the kind that comes not from losing something, but from understanding clearly and too late the value of what you gave away. He looked at Ruth. "I'm not here for Hargrove," he said. "I haven't spoken to Hargrove in 11 days. Ruth waited. Loretta and I—" He stopped. Started again. "The situation at home has changed. Significantly." He pressed his lips together. "That's not something I'm going to explain right now. I'm not here to explain that." "Then what are you here for?" Ruth asked. He held out the manila envelope. Ruth didn't move toward it immediately. She looked at it, at his hands, holding it at his face above it. She noticed what she hadn't when he was younger: the way his hands in this moment were not in his pockets. They were extended, offering. Whatever the gesture cost him, he was not protecting himself from the cost. "The original hospital documents," he said. "From March, the full packet. The consent forms, the authorization pages, the disclosure forms that were included, and the ones that weren't included but should have been." He paused. "I kept the originals. Loretta doesn't know. She thinks I gave everything to the lawyers." Another pause, shorter. "I couldn't give them to the lawyers." Ruth stood up slowly. She crossed the greenhouse floor and took the envelope from his hands. She held it without opening it. "Why?" she asked. Gideon looked at her. His own face, not his father's, his own, carrying the specific weight of 58 years. All of them hers, in a way that nothing could entirely undo. "Because you're my mother," he said. And that was all. No elaboration, no architecture of apology. Just the plain fact of it, stated in the voice of a man who had traveled a very long distance to arrive back at something true. Ruth held the envelope against her chest. She looked at her son for a long moment. At 58 years of a person she had built and loved and lost sight of and found again in this cold November greenhouse in the form of a manila envelope with softened corners. She thought about what she had told Vivian on the bench on Crescent Avenue. A managed decision is still a decision. She thought about what it cost to make a different one when you were already 40 steps down the wrong road. And the only way back was through the admission of everything. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not a thing of moments. Forgiveness was a thing of time and action and evidence built slowly. The way trust is built, the way a garden is built, not in a single night, but across seasons tended consistently, with no guarantee of what the yield would be. But she reached out and put her hand on his arm. Just once. Just briefly. The specific touch of a mother who has not stopped being a mother even when everything else is broken. "Go home," she said. "Deal with what's yours to deal with. Then we'll see." He nodded. He did not cry. He was not the kind of man who cried easily, and she had known that since he was small, and it had never been a failing, just a fact about who he was. He turned and walked back through the greenhouse. At the entrance, he stopped once his back to her. "The tomatoes," he said. "Are they really growing?" Ruth looked at the eastern section, at the plants in their rows improbably green in the lantern light, at the system running beneath them, faithful and quiet, doing exactly what Eleanor Marsh had built it to do. "Yes," she said, "they really are." He left. Vivian, who had been lying still in her corner of the greenhouse and had heard everything without pretending otherwise, said nothing for a long moment after the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she said very quietly, "You should sleep." Ruth looked down at the envelope in her hands. Then she set it carefully beside the journal. Eleanor's documentation and Gideon's side by side on the dry shelf they had made from salvaged boards, and lay back down on her coat. She did not sleep for a long time, but she was still. The hearing was in December. In a county administrative office, on the second floor of a building that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. Ruth and Vivian sat on one side of a long table with Stellan between them. Hargrove and two attorneys sat on the other side. A county administrator named Preswick, methodical, expressionless, carrying the particular stillness of someone who had made many decisions in rooms like this one, and had learned that stillness was its own form of authority, sat at the head of the table with a recorder running and a yellow legal pad in front of him. The process was not dramatic. Legal processes rarely were in Ruth's experience. They were slow and careful, and built from paper and precedent, and the accumulated weight of decisions made by people like Preswick, who had seen many versions of many disputes, and had learned to look for the thing that was actually true beneath the thing that was being argued. Stellan presented the documentation, the journal, the diagram, the city account records, which, when formally pulled, showed 35 years of uninterrupted automated payment from the city of Shelby Falls to the water utility for account CG-1989-447, attached to the address of the greenhouse parcel. He presented Eleanor's original grant application, retrieved from city archives with a formal records request. He presented the hospital documents from March, the originals from Gideon's manila envelope showing clearly that the property transfer authorization had been embedded in a packet of surgical consent and insurance forms, without separate disclosure or independent witness. Hargrove's attorneys argued. They were good. They raised counterpoints about the dormancy of the city account, about the gap between the garden's active operation and the current situation, about the proper legal interpretation of informed consent in a medical context. They raised all the points that needed to be raised because they were professionals doing their job. Prestwick listened to all of it. He wrote things on his legal pad. He asked 3 questions, each of them precise, and targeted, each of them landing in exactly the part of the argument where the answer mattered most. At the end, he said he would issue a decision within 30 days. On the way out, Hargrove stopped beside Ruth in the hallway. His professional composure was fully restored. Whatever pressure had shown through it at the greenhouse was gone, sealed back beneath the surface where it lived. Whatever the outcome, he said, you should know this was never personal. Ruth looked at him. I know, she said. That's what made it so easy for you. She walked past him to where Vivian was waiting at the end of the hall. The decision came in 22 days. Stellan called Ruth on the small phone at first light. His voice careful and precise, in the way it got when he was managing his own reaction to something significant. She listened to him read the summary of Prestwick's ruling standing outside the greenhouse in the December cold, her free hand in her coat pocket, closed around the old key she still carried. The property transfer of the greenhouse parcel to Gideon Calloway and the subsequent sale to Meridian Property Group were suspended pending a full review of the city's interest in the parcel, based on the 35-year continuous account relationship and the original grant documentation. The review period was 90 days, during which the current occupants could not be legally removed. The hospital documentation had been referred to a separate process, the county attorney's office, which would determine whether the property transfer authorization signed by Ruth in March constituted a fraudulent instrument. That process would take longer, months, possibly more. It was not guaranteed to produce any particular outcome, but the greenhouse was for now protected. Ruth stood in the December morning holding the phone after Stellan had finished speaking. She looked at the greenhouse behind her, at the sign Shelby Community Garden, established 1989, its letters freshly painted steady in the winter light. Mrs. Calloway. Stellan's voice came through the phone. Are you there? Yes, Ruth said. I'm here. It's not over. The full review. I understand, Ruth said. It's never fully over. A brief pause. How do you feel? Ruth thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about everything. About the porch and the new lock and the empty rooms through the window. About the bench on Crescent Avenue in the October dark. About the gap in the fence and the soil that was alive when it had no right to be. About the small green line breaking through the surface on the 4th morning. About Darlene and Gordon and the others who had come and stayed. About the journal with its neat, unhurried handwriting. About the pipe running beneath the December ground carrying water in the dark, doing exactly what it was built to do. About Gideon standing in the cold with a manila envelope in his extended hands. I feel like something is still working, she said. That's enough for right now. She ended the call. She stood for another moment in the cold, the phone in one hand and the old key in the other. Then she put the key back in her pocket and went inside. Vivian was at the eastern section checking the plants, the way she checked them every morning with the specific care of someone who had made a decision to invest in something and intended to honor that decision with attention. She looked up when Ruth came in. She read Ruth's face the way she had read it for 60 years. "Well," she said. "We stay," Ruth said. "For now, we stay." Vivian nodded. She turned back to the plants. "They've grown again," she said. "Overnight. Look at this one." Ruth came to stand beside her. She looked at the plant Vivian was indicating fuller, now stronger than it had been even a week ago. The leaves catching the winter light that came through the patched panels in long pale strips. A sound at the entrance made them both turn. The young woman, the one who had come weeks ago, uncertain, asking who owned the greenhouse, asking how it worked, stood at the entrance. She was holding a small paper bag, handling it carefully with both hands. "I brought seeds," she said, "from my neighbor's garden. She said she wasn't going to use them." She looked at the bag, then at Ruth. "I didn't know if that was useful." Ruth looked at the bag, at the young woman's face, still uncertain, still carrying the particular fragility of someone who has been without solid ground for long enough that they have learned not to assume it will be offered. "Come in," Ruth said. The young woman came in. She looked around the greenhouse slowly, the way everyone looked around it the first time, not just seeing the space, but absorbing it, the warmth that persisted when it had no right to the green that grew, when the logic said otherwise, the sense of a place that had been left for dead and had refused the designation. "Who owns this?" she asked. The same question she had asked before. Ruth looked at her, then at Vivian, then at the plants in their rows and the patched glass above them, and the sign on the fence outside, and the soil beneath her feet, with Eleanor's water running through it in the dark. "No one," she said, "and everyone who takes care of it." The young woman thought about that. Then she opened the paper bag and looked at the seeds inside. "What should I do with these?" Ruth looked at the northeastern corner of the greenhouse, the one section they had not yet planted. The ground there, still bare and dark and waiting. "Come here," Ruth said. "I'll show you." They knelt together at the edge of the bare soil. Ruth's old hands and the young woman's uncertain ones, and Ruth worked the earth to test the depth and the moisture and the temperature of it. The same earth Eleanor Marsh had loved and mapped and preserved across 35 years of absence. The same earth that had grown tomatoes from seeds, sealed in a metal box under the floor, while the world forgot it existed. "Press your hands into the soil," Ruth said. "Feel the temperature." The young woman pressed her palms into the earth and her eyes widened slightly. "It's warm." "Yes." "How?" "There's a system," Ruth said. "Someone built it a long time ago. Built it to keep working after she was gone." She took one of the seeds from the young woman's bag and held it up in the pale December light. She built it for people she would never meet. The young woman looked at the seed. "That's..." She stopped. Tried again. "That's a remarkable thing to do." "Yes," Ruth said. "It is." She pressed the seed into the earth, then another. Then she guided the young woman's hand to show her the depth, the angle, the spacing. Not because the young woman couldn't figure it out on her own eventually, but because some things are best passed hand to hand, person to person, the way they have always been passed, the way they will keep being passed long after the hands that first held them are gone. They planted the seeds one by one in the northeastern corner of the greenhouse in Eleanor Marsh's soil, while December light moved across the broken and patched glass above them, and the water ran below them in its pipes, and Vivian hummed something low and tuneless from the eastern section, where she was checking the tomatoes. When the last seed was in the ground, the young woman sat back on her heels and looked at the soil. "Now what?" she asked. Ruth pressed the earth flat above the final seed with the palm of her hand carefully, with the attention of someone who has learned that the beginning of a thing deserves as much care as anything that comes after it. She thought about Eleanor writing by lamplight in 1992, afraid the garden would be used as something other than what it was. She thought about the pipe system running 35 feet beneath the December ground, faithful and unseen, doing its work in the dark. She thought about the key in her coat pocket, the old one, the one that no longer opened any door she currently owned, and why she still carried it, not for the door it had once opened, for what it remembered, for what it knew about the difference between a house and a home, and about how the things you build with your hands and your years and your stubborn refusal to quit belong to you in ways that no lock change and no legal document and no quiet dismissal on a porch in October can fully reach. She thought about Gideon's extended hands in the lamplight, holding a manila envelope with softened corners. She thought about Eleanor's final line, "I hope someone someday will know how." Someone had. "Now," Ruth said, "we take care of it." Outside December held the town of Shelby Falls in its cold gray grip, and the maple tree on the street, where Ruth had lived for 43 years, stood bare and patient in the wind, waiting for spring, the way it had waited for every spring before, untroubled by the cold, because the cold was not the end of anything, only the middle of it, only the season between what was and what would be. And in the greenhouse at the edge of the field, that no one had wanted, in the soil that had refused to die, something small and certain pressed upward toward the light, the way it had been doing since September, the way it would keep doing long after the people who planted it were gone, because that was what Eleanor Marsh had built it to do: hold people, grow things, last.